I'll hand over the discussion now to Matthew Cebul, who will be giving us his final intervention. So let me say just a few words about Matthew. Matthew is right now the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies Postdoctoral Fellow since last year and through 2021. His research agenda lies at the intersection of international security and comparative politics, and he has a regional focus on the Middle East, having earned his PhD in political science from Yale in December 2019. He's continued to work on these topics, studying things at the crossroads of international security, democratization, US foreign policy, always with this focus on the Middle East. His dissertation at Yale was entitled Repression and Rebellion in the Shadow of Foreign Intervention, or at least that's now the current working title, which relates to his main area of research, exploring the international dimensions of civil resistance in autocracies. And he has a number of projects either in publication, forthcoming, or under development here, exploring different questions related to this line of research, such as how the movement structure conditions international support for civil resistance campaigns. Also, questions of how to better understand how the US is perceived by global actors in the context of international relations. Research on the importance of US mediation in various foreign conflicts, such as the dynamics between Jordan and Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War, and other titles related to these areas of research. He has work forthcoming in the Journal of Politics, and has written for the Carnegie Endowment, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy Research Institute, and Political Violence at a Glance, among other places. And so we're really lucky to have him here, in general, to have him on campus, and to have him with us today to wrap up as kind of the grand finale of our discussion. And he will speak to us today on the unintended consequences of international support for civil resistance campaigns, evidence from Syria. So Matthew, with that, I'll hand it over to you and mute myself. And as usual, we'll come back to questions. So please, everyone, take questions down as you're listening, and we'll come back to questions through the chat after he's finished. Thanks, Matthew. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Ryan. As you can see, the title slide here matches my book project, and the title slide I gave you is another, I guess, potential title in the running for this book. I'm really grateful to be here with you all today. Before we start, I just want to say that I made the mistake of going outside today. I had the audacity to leave my house, and I'm now dealing with some just unforeseen allergies. So if at some point I might have to mute myself and sneeze a little bit here, so just don't worry, I'm fighting it off. I'll be fine, but you might have to hear me sneeze a couple times. Okay, let's see if I can make this go forward. There we go. So we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of the Syrian Revolution in a couple months here in March. And given the extreme level of violence that has characterized the Syrian civil war, it's easy to forget that the Syrian Revolution began as a nonviolent uprising in March 2011. Was a nationwide civil resistance campaign, which I guess the high water mark was in July 2011. This photo is from July 2011 in Hama, which was, I guess, the epicenter of protests at the time. Hama was regularly producing protests of around 500,000 people every weekend in July. And then pretty quickly after that, the opposition started to embrace more armed tactics. They began defending nonviolent protest with armed guards. The Free Syrian Army formed. They started to use more guerrilla tactics. And by spring 2012, what was a nonviolent uprising had descended into a civil war with some really devastating consequences. This photo is from Homs in 2015. Which has been just destroyed by the civil war. Something like 500,000 Syrians have lost their lives. There are over 5 million refugees, even more internally displaced persons, and untold economic damage. So I think it's pretty compelling that we need an explanation for how we got from this initially nonviolent protest campaign to the defining humanitarian tragedy of the 21st century. And I'm certainly far from the only person interested in this question. There have been a number of policy pieces written about things that the US in particular could have done to avert the conflict, or whether those efforts would have mattered. I'm not actually sure whether you all got the suggested reading that I sent, but this report from Mona Yacoubian on critical junctures in US foreign policy towards Syria is, I think, a pretty important read. There's also just been a deluge of editorial pieces about what the US should or should not have done. It's been practically impossible to miss this debate. The Syrian civil war is probably the defining issue of Obama's foreign policy. So one of the things that comes up in these debates is about US encouragement for the nonviolent opposition, or international encouragement, not just from the US. So that the idea is that international support offered the movement false hope. And one of the most common examples is US Ambassador Ford's trip to Hama, the same site of that enormous protest that I just showed you. A couple days before that protest happened, Ford traveled to Hama to kind of demonstrate that, unlike the Assad regime's propaganda was claiming, the protests were in fact nonviolent. The Assad regime obviously was not very happy with this, so they issued this scathing announcement that the US was meddling in Syrian domestic affairs, and they actually helped to orchestrate a mob to attack the US embassy in Damascus the following Monday. The State Department ends up replying to these affronts that the reason they sent Ford to Hama was to make absolutely clear with his physical presence that we stand with those Syrians who are expressing their right to speak for change, who want a democratic future, and who are expressing those views peacefully. Now, I suspect that I'm not the only one who reads that and is a little taken aback by kind of how forceful that language is versus, what actually happened in Syria. Nevertheless, people want to know whether these types of episodes of encouragement like this mattered. So some have argued that Ford's visit to Hama, among other things, helped to unjustifiably gave Syrians false hope that we then failed to deliver on. And others have argued that these types of events didn't really matter much for the course of the uprising. So the book project was, or I guess I should say the dissertation was initially an effort to adjudicate this debate. I wanted to understand how US policy may influence the Syrian revolution for better and for worse. Along the way, the book project has evolved to answering a couple related questions that are more academic or scholarly focused. Why do some movements persist despite severe repression while others die out? And then why do some movements remain nonviolent while others escalate to violence? So this book kind of answers these questions, and in so doing gets at the policy question I've listed above. And the argument I want to make for you all today, hopefully I'll convince you, is that opposition behavior during nonviolent revolutions or civil resistance campaigns is importantly shaped by the international environment that the movement unfolds in, and activists' corresponding expectations for external support. And then counterintuitively, in some cases, I'll argue that external encouragement for nonviolence actually increases the risk of armed escalation later on. So to make this argument, I'll first go over a couple reasons why I think these insights are not really present in the literature on civil resistance as they stand. I'll then detail the theory that the book generates, and then kind of walk you through what I think is going on or what happened in 2011 in Syria. And I'll conclude by talking about some of the academic and policy implications of the argument for you all to think over. Okay, so anecdotally, there's quite a lot of evidence that civil resistance campaigns see international outreach as an important part of nonviolent strategy. These photos are all taken from recent campaigns that pretty clearly feature international outreach. Protesters are trying to cajole international actors to do things. Now, despite the fact that we have good reason to think that civil resistance often goes global, the literature on civil resistance has recently really gone local. So civil resistance scholars are fixated on local agency over global structure or democracy promotion as means to explain movement outcomes. So to make that clearer, civil resistance scholars usually argue that movement outcomes are a function of the opposition's behavior. So they want to say that the opposition's tactical ingenuity, its commitment to nonviolence, its nonviolent discipline, its organizational resilience, its behavioral choices, that its own agency, these things all matter for the outcomes of civil resistance campaigns above and beyond structural impediments that they might face, like say very repressive regimes, and above and beyond international pressure or not. So Gene Sharp, famous nonviolent activist, argues that liberation from dictatorships ultimately depends on the people's ability to liberate themselves. So I think that this general relegation of democracy promotion behind local agency is smart. This is something that the civil resistance literature is right to do. At the same time, I think that the scholarship has insufficiently considered how the opposition strategy is shaped by the global environment in which these movements are unfolding. So most of the democracy promotion literature, or just kind of general editorial pieces on democracy promotion that you may be familiar with, they're interested in how international pressure affects the regime's behavior, but nobody really seems to think about how international pressure or kind of the availability of international support might be affecting the opposition's behavior. There's a little bit of past work in this vein, and I'm hoping to continue that trend. So to do so, I draw on some of the insights from literature on civil wars. So that literature has pretty well established that many aspects of civil wars are shaped by third-party intervention, including the onset of war. That intervention can extend its duration, and kind of third-party oversight can also affect combatant behavior in civil wars. So we seem pretty confident of those things. The problem is that there's very little cross-fertilization between the literature on civil resistance and the literature on civil wars. For some reasons, scholars have treated these two things as separate phenomena, even though I suspect that if you sat down and thought about it for a minute, you'd realize that they're quite interrelated. Sometimes nonviolent movements escalate into armed rebellions. Whether it's nonviolent or violent, these are both mechanisms by which opposition movements resist the state or demand reforms. So, there should be some linkages there, but insights haven't trickled over. And so I think that the argument that I'm going to make will hopefully try to do that. So the contributions of the argument you're about to see, I illuminate the international determinants of local activism while merging the study of nonviolent and violent resistance. Okay, now I got the boring stuff out of the way. So what does the theory do? I make a couple arguments in the book. The first set of arguments considers how expectations for external support influence the opposition's behavior, and then considers how those behavioral changes subsequently affect the risk of violent escalation. And then another part of the theory chapter considers how activists determine the likelihood of international support. That will come up a lot in my discussion of Syria, but I won't bore you with the kind of abstract theoretical part. So I identify two direct effects of external support on movement behavior. So things that when the opposition anticipates external support, a couple things happen. The first I call the emboldening effect. So this one's pretty straightforward. The anticipation of external support increases the opposition's confidence. And that happens for a couple reasons. You might think that external support would increase the opposition's confidence because activists anticipate that the international spotlight will force regimes to avoid or mitigate the use of repression in order to avoid international punishment. And obviously, less repression is good for opposition movements, so they think that they're likely to pay lower costs of repression if they choose to mobilize. And then even if the regime does choose to repress, external support can still help movements succeed, whether it's via diplomatic isolation or pressure, economic sanctions, or at the limit, even military intervention. So kind of irrespective of what the regime chooses to do, external support is good for movements in this way. So that means that if kind of behaviorally, if the opposition anticipates external support, I argue that they are likely to be more willing to persistently mobilize despite initial regime efforts to repress, either because the opposition thinks that repression will be limited in scope or duration, or because they think they're just more likely to achieve their demands anyways, with the help of international allies. And then by the same token, movements that anticipate external support are also more likely to stick with maximal demands for regime change instead of satisficing with lesser reforms. So they think that regime change is more feasible with international allies, which means they're less willing to compromise. So that's the emboldening effect. The second direct effect I identify as what I call the visibility effect. So I want to argue that the possibility of external engagement influences how the opposition understands nonviolent strategy. So this is a bit more involved, but bear with me. So if external allies are available and could really help an opposition movement succeed, then recruiting them, attracting their support, is a really important strategic objective for the opposition. Now, it turns out that this is not always easy to do. Bob in 2005 is a really great look at how movements try to shape the narrative around the movement to resonate most strongly with potential international allies. And he argues that movements rely on the politics of spectacle to attract international attention in a really crowded international media market. Countries have lots of things to worry about in international politics, and so it's very difficult for one issue to take priority. So movements are, need to rely on these really flashy, spectacular episodes of resistance to force potential international allies to really pay attention and recognize the need for action. So how does that have anything to do with nonviolent strategy? One way to think about that is provided by Schock, who breaks down different nonviolent tactics into tactics of concentration versus tactics of dispersion. So tactics of concentration are what you probably think of when you think about nonviolence. They include, mass protests, demonstrations, vigils, sit-ins, these types of quintessential nonviolent activities, but those are far from the only nonviolent tools available to opposition movements. Tactics of dispersion also impose costs on regimes, but do not require participants to congregate together in one place. So examples include strikes or boycotts or work slowdowns, these types of behaviors. Again, these impose costs on the regime. They may potentially cripple certain industries or help to express public disapproval of the regime, but it makes it these opposition actors don't have to congregate together, which makes it harder for the regime to target them. It's less risky, less vulnerable to repression, as we'll talk about in a second. But the key part for now is that if you're interested in the politics of spectacle, because you're hoping to recruit international allies, you're going to prefer tactics of concentration to tactics of dispersion, because tactics of concentration are much more visible to international audiences than tactics of dispersion. So the argument I'm kind of in a nutshell is that opposition movements that think that it is going to be possible for them to recruit external allies will do their best to capitalize on a favorable international environment by making their movement as visible as possible, and therefore will preferentially employ tactics of concentration over dispersion. So in sum, the expectation of foreign support leads movements to be more persistent, to make more maximalist demands, and to be more visible than they might be otherwise. So these are the direct effects of external support on civil resistance campaigns. What does that have to do with armed escalation? So I now argue that one downstream indirect consequence of these behavioral changes is worsened opposition exposure to repression. Now, that's somewhat counterintuitive because I've already claimed above that international attention can help mitigate repression, and it does in some cases. But you can imagine other cases where the opposition persists against tough regimes that would have previously either deterred mobilization outright, so the opposition's too afraid to protest at all, or would have successfully and quickly suppressed mobilization that did emerge. So in these cases, these tougher regimes, the opposition chooses to try and endure repression because it is emboldened by international support. But these tough regimes, sometimes are capable of enduring international pressure themselves. So the result is that you wind up with an opposition movement determined or emboldened to persist, confronting a regime that's just determined to repress. It's relatively hardened against threats from below. It's relatively capable of resisting international pressure. And these are the circumstances that are really just the perfect breeding ground for prolonged, protracted exposure to repression. Another reason why opposition movements that anticipate external support would experience repression is that they're slower to adapt more dispersed tactics. So as I said before, tactics of dispersion, the reason that you employ these tactics is because it's much harder for the regime to target you. So it's much safer for movement participants to engage in dispersed tactics. So I don't want to say the correct or rational thing to do, but one smart thing to do when you're facing really repressive regimes is to embrace kind of a more long-term dispersed set of tactics that impose costs on the regime without kind of really forcing movement participants to endure extremely violent repression. But if you're really focused on attracting international support, you might be less willing to do that because you think that tactics of dispersion are insufficiently visible and that it's important to continue mobilizing in public. So for both reasons, I think that external encouragement can produce movements that are ultimately more exposed to repression than they might have been otherwise. And the result is radicalization. So we know for a number of reasons that repression is a really potent driver of radicalization. I'll rattle a couple off just to give you a sense of what the literature thinks. Repression can discredit nonviolent activism. So certainly it's very, very difficult to continue justifying nonviolent protests when what happens when you go and protest is that the regime shoots and kills you. Kind of more directly, the regime can simply eliminate prominent nonviolent activists. So if the regime is busy killing all of the movement figureheads, it may be difficult because these are the same people who are advocating for continued nonviolent discipline, and the regime is just removing them from the board. At the same time, then, the regime empowers violent fringes who offer either protection from the regime's abuses or the promise of revenge, both of which can be really compelling. Those fringe groups tend to engage in outbidding. They use violence to signal resolve, and their resolve to fight the movement. So the more violence they use, the more resolved they seem, and therefore they attract more support. So the long and short of it is that movements that are exposed to repression for prolonged periods of time are at greater risk of violent escalation or the collapse of nonviolent discipline than movements that are less exposed to repression. Okay, so the argument that I'm making implies a trade-off then. If the regime happens to be weak, external pressure very well may hasten reform. So you can imagine that external pressure makes it very difficult for weak regimes that can't endure domestic plus international pressure to repress effectively, and then they're just forced to cough up reforms or they kind of quickly fold. Against tougher regimes, however, the opposite might happen. We might just end up encouraging mobilization into a tough regime that is not going to back down and that is also capable of enduring international pressure for at least some period of time. So during that period of time, the opposition is going to be highly exposed to repression. And I think that can generate the conditions of possibility for the escalation of nonviolent movements into full-blown civil wars. Okay, so that's the argument. The empirical core of the book thus far is a process tracing analysis of the 2011 Syrian Revolution, which constitutes somewhere in between a theory building and theory testing case. I'm happy to talk more about the methodological implications of that in the Q&A if you're all interested. I conducted interviews with 130 Syrian activists and militants over 9 months of fieldwork in Turkey. Obviously, I couldn't go to Syria because of the civil war, but many, like literally millions of Syrians fled to Turkey as a result of the conflict. And Turkey was kind of helped to host the formal Syrian opposition in exile. So there were lots of, the Syrian activist community is quite dense there. So I was able to meet and interview activists there. I also conducted an online activist survey that I won't be talking about today, but the idea there was to try and make sure I was speaking with Syrians or at least got information from Syrians who were not living in Turkey. And in any event, the goal of the interviews was to track activists' beliefs about the international environment, the risks of repression, the types of foreign support that they wanted or that they desired, that they thought was possible, their resistance strategy, their beliefs about how long the revolution would take, yada, 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 all of that over the first year of the revolution. So I wanted to capture the kind of onset of protests and then this shift to violence that was, I think, pretty... There's no official start date for the Syrian civil war, but I would say certainly by February or March 2012, I would put it there. And then, you can even argue earlier that by November or December 2011, it was pretty clear that armed elements had taken over a big chunk of the opposition, even though nonviolent resistance continued for years. Okay. I forgot to say, this photo at the right here is a photo that I took in Gaziantep, Turkey, which is just 20 miles north of the Syrian border. It's a group that the Syrian activist community, as I said, is quite strong in Gaziantep. Here, activists have come together to protest, this was in 2018, to protest the Assad regime's starvation campaign that they were levying against eastern Ghouta, which was a suburb of Damascus that they were busy besieging. And eventually that siege proved effective. Okay. So the first thing that comes out of the interviews that I think is important to understand are a set of pre-revolutionary indicators of international support. So even before the Syrian Revolution began, Syrians had decent reason to think that the international environment was pretty favorable to nonviolent protest. I think there are three, as you can see at the left here, three factors that really stand out. The first two go hand in hand: the relative power of a liberal international order that's committed to human rights norms. So Syrians had witnessed for the better part of 20 years prior to the Syrian Revolution, kind of Western power doing whatever it wanted in the Middle East. The US was very willing to flex its muscles repeatedly and often did so kind of under the guise of democracy promotion. Now, certainly, Syrians would not tell you that the US has been a perfect embodiment of human rights norms, but they did recognize that the US and the UN kind of had together pushed for the formation of these institutions and sets of norms that drove towards the preservation of human rights and democracy promotion, in particular, this responsibility to protect norm, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And then the third factor was the Syrians' recognition of relatively high global interconnectivity as a result of modern information and communications technology. And this, again, this will become clearer as we go through the case. But the critical point that I want to make here is that all of these intuitions they were concretely manifested in what happened in Libya in February and March of 2011, right before the Syrian Revolution starts. So to briefly recap that, protests in Libya begin. Gaddafi responds violently almost instantly. I mean, admittedly, the Libyan conflict becomes an armed conflict almost overnight. But Gaddafi promises to, eventually to go house by house and liquidate the opposition. He promises that there'll be no mercy. And in response to this, the Libyan opposition calls for international help. And they pretty much get it almost instantly. So in the February 26th, the UN refers Gaddafi to the International Criminal Court. On the end of February, the US Senate passes a resolution asking Obama to pressure the UN to impose a no-fly zone over Libya. That is, in fact, organized over the next couple of weeks at the UN. And by March 17th, the UN Security Council takes a vote to impose this no-fly zone, which turns into a systematic demolition of the Libyan armed forces. You'll see here, this photo at the right is all of the UN Security Council representatives taking a vote on this issue, with the exception of the representative from the Russian Federation who abstains. And that is a kind of, in hindsight, a sad indicator of what was to come for Syria. But the point here is that Syrians witnessed a very clear example of the international community stepping up to defend these human rights norms that it had been touting for the past 20 years. It was enacting its responsibility to protect, and that it could do so with ease, given how much stronger the international community was, backed by NATO and US power, than literally any other state in the region. They also got to witness all of this kind of in real time. They were watching the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, and all of them were covered really extensively by international media. So this Libya scenario, as it's now called, really colored how Syrians understood what was likely to happen in their own state. So during this initial mobilization period in March and April, you would be surprised by how many Syrians actually anticipated that the regime would reform. So they would tell me a number of things: that Assad was a young and reformist-minded leader. He was Western-oriented. He'd married this young British woman. He wasn't like his father. So there was, a number of Assad apologists, even among the opposition. Still, even for those who anticipated repression, most thought that repression would be restrained in some respect or other. So this one Damascus activist who helped to played a key role in building the infrastructure for the local coordinating committees at the national level that helped to kind of loosely coordinate the Syrian protests, told me that we understood that the regime would resist, but it would not go brutal like Gaddafi. Why? Because it did not turn out well for him. So the bombing, the US is busy sending Tomahawk missiles into Libya on March 18th, which is coincidentally the same day that protests start in Syria. So Syrians think, okay, well, the regime is repressive and is not just going to give up. Our regime is strong, but it's also not stupid. And so Assad should recognize that extreme levels of violence are just not tolerable, that this is not a viable strategy for him, so he won't do that. And similarly, Mazen Darwish, who was a really prominent activist and lawyer even before the Syrian Revolution began, contended that social media and the possibility of sharing news with the world directly will protect us. Again, I'll come back to that here in just a second. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that I do not, for reasons of personal security, I don't name any of the activists in this talk, except for those who explicitly requested that I name them and were already quite prominent. So Mazen Darwish is an extremely prominent activist, which is why I mentioned them by name, but you won't hear me name others. So to conclude this slide, I want to say that I'm not trying to argue, and I don't argue that the promise of external support was somehow the proximal cause for protest onset in Syria. That's almost certainly not the case. In political science terms, protest onset in Syria was overdetermined by a number of factors, including building local grievances in Syria that had been festering for a decade since Assad gained power. There's lots of reading you can do about how his neoliberal reforms were really harmful for the regime's traditional base of support. Certainly what happened in Tunisia and Egypt was really inspiring for Syrians. So those factors alone would have easily could have been easily used in hindsight to explain protest onset in Syria. However, I do want to claim that this favorable international environment was reassuring for the Syrian opposition because it kind of delimited how they thought the regime would respond to protests and kind of set the conditions of possibility for success. Okay, so now the expectations of the Assad apologists were pretty quickly defied by the regime in April and May, as the regime demonstrates pretty quickly that it's willing to repress and that it has no interest in reform. I mean, Assad does offer some, I guess, cursory reforms. He promises to lift the emergency law on April 17th. Meanwhile, he's busy murdering Syrians left and right. So obviously the promise is incredible. So despite the fact that the regime is repressing heavily and showing that it's not going to back down, that it won't fold like a cheap house of cards, we find that protests only persevere and in fact grow during this period of time. So one reason I think that happens is that the Syrian opposition remains emboldened by their beliefs about the international environment and the prospect of international support. One Damascus activist who is now helping to organize the Syrian civil defense kind of summed this up nicely. He says that we thought at the time that we just need to tell the world and the problem will be solved. Later on, we realized that the world already knows what's happening, but it's about political will, not about knowledge. We couldn't imagine that in the 21st century, a leader could send his troops to the street and shoot people so freely and the world would not say anything. So there are a couple of things to unpack here. The first is this last little clause about the 21st century human rights norms. This, I can't overstate how frequently these types of comments were made by the activists I interviewed. They all recognize that the US was an imperfect advocate for human rights. They certainly, the vast majority of Syrians strongly disapprove of the US actions versus Palestine, for example. So they're not under the impression that the US supports human rights all the time. But they did think that there was a certain threshold of violence beyond which the international community would simply be compelled to act in defense of some bare minimum standards of human decency, let's say. So that featured pretty prominently. And then this first clause is also important. They said that, he says that we thought at the time that we just need to tell the world and the problem will be solved. So this idea that the goal of the movement is to help expose the Assad regime. And where does that come from? It turns out that there's a pretty important historical precedent for the opposition's emphasis on visibility and global attention. So the last time that the Assad regime experienced serious nationwide, like a nationwide resistance campaign was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So at this time, the Muslim Brotherhood is organizing against the kind of newly established, not newly established, but still kind of consolidating Assad regime that it didn't really like very much. They also found some support among more secular aspects of society. So this movement was pretty widespread, but it was focused in Hama, which was a real strong point for the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, in 1982, Hafez al-Assad just brutally crushes this movement. He sends the army to barricade Hama. This is, again, the same city that I showed you those protests of 500,000 protesters in July 2011 before, same city. So he sends the army, locks off the city, and proceeds over the course of a week to slaughter somewhere between 10 and 30,000 Syrians. Nobody actually knows how many people died. And the reason nobody knows is that Assad did all of this by kind of under the cover of a media blackout. So he totally obstructed all information coming out of the city, prevented anybody from hearing about it. No international media was allowed into Syria. So basically he gets, in the Syrians' minds, he gets away with this scot-free. So one student activist from Midan, which is a suburb of Damascus, kind of described a pretty common sentiment, which was that among younger Syrians, which was that my parents used to tell me about what happened in Hama. They didn't get any news about it until 6 months later. And so we said, okay, now globalization, technology, media would help. So what this activist is conveying is the reason that repression was successful in the 1980s was that it was done under the cover of this media blackout, that nobody knew about what was going on. So the solution to repression then was to expose Assad's abuses, to show the world what was going on, and kind of, his downfall would follow after that. Another activist from Hama, from this very city, puts it more succinctly: it's not 1982, the world is watching this time. One other important aspect of kind of this fixation or the sense of importance on kind of showing the world what was going on is Syrians' recognition about the balance of power. So both as a kind of a product of the Syrian regime's own propaganda about US meddling in the Middle East, and also as a kind of generic product of Syrians watching what the US does in the Middle East, most Syrians have kind of hold this belief about extensive US power. So they think that the US can get almost whatever it wants, whenever it wants. So one Aleppo student activist put it this way: the US can act in any place it wants. It was very clear. You can't deny it. Everybody knew it. When the US wants something to happen, it will happen. So the implication here is that, if we can get the US and NATO and the UN on board, this, Assad is done and dusted. And in fact, Syrians were so convinced by the kind of overwhelming magnitude or perhaps the overwhelming inferiority of the Assad regime relative to these powerhouses, that all that was required out of the international community was a credible threat. So the same activist from earlier, oh, actually, I'm sorry, I've mislabeled. This one is a diaspora activist who was working from Saudi Arabia at the time, helping to coordinate some of the online media presence of the Syrian opposition. So this activist told me that we had a strong belief that if the Americans sent a decisive message to Bashar al-Assad to stop shooting at protesters, he would not dare to shoot. And that was a pretty common sentiment. So the crux of the point I'm making here is that Syrians thought that international intervention in Syria would be dirt cheap, that it would be very, very easy for international actors to effect change because they're so much stronger than the Assad regime. So now I think we have the context required to evaluate this initial policy puzzle that I presented. Did external encouragement matter? So I should point out that during the summer of 2011, kind of these international outreach efforts looked like they were succeeding. So Turkey and the EU especially, and also to some degree the Saudi Arabia, were becoming increasingly vocal critics of the Assad regime, along with the United States, which makes a number of statements as kind of spring turns to summer. I think the most important two or three was Ford visiting Hama, and then a lot of Syrian activists mentioned this Assad has lost legitimacy quote as really resonating, I think because they also just perceived that Assad had no legitimacy, so this kind of language really resonated with them. And then obviously the most important one is when Obama announces that he thinks that Assad must resign in mid-August. So to some degree, it seems like this international outreach is working, but it should be noted that none of these statements actually committed the international community to do anything. So in some of these statements, Obama announces the kind of onset of some sanctions, but he doesn't ever promise to remove Assad. He doesn't promise military intervention. And in fact, a lot of these statements make it pretty clear that the US understands that Syrians don't want external intervention, which was, this is a bit complicated, but that was true. Syrians, because they didn't think that military intervention was necessary. So they didn't like the idea of external kind of military intervention into Syria that would muck everything up, but they did want external pressure on Assad, which they thought would be effective via this credible threat mechanism. In any event, so you might think that the fact that these are just generic statements means that they shouldn't matter that much. Again, we're not promising anything. These statements, diplomatic statements, don't commit the US or the UN to do anything really. However, I think that misses the kind of crux of what was going on, which was that Syrians saw this overwhelmingly powerful international community that was committed to human rights norms, and it becomes very easy to conflate preferences with intentions. The activist from Damascus earlier, who helped to organize the Syrian civil defense, puts it this way. Obama is not a grocer in the street. Obama is the president of the United States of America. This is the superpower of the world. When he says that Bashar should step aside, it's a policy. He's stating a policy. He's stating a decision. He's stating that he should step aside, that the US policy is to push him to step aside. So what's going on here is that because Syrians thought that external intervention was so cheap, they really paid attention to what these statements were, because the presumption was, well, if the international community prefers that Assad leaves, it'll be really easy for them to make that happen. So all we need to do is convince them that Assad needs to leave, and then Assad will be pushed out. So I think that these statements probably mattered more than most analysts would be willing to admit, not because I guess political scientists might call them cheap talk, but I think they really kind of reaffirm Syrian activists' prior beliefs about the favorable international environment in which they found themselves. Okay, the last thing I'll say has to do with the shift from the nonviolent phase into the violent phase. So July and early August 2011 is a major inflection point. Now we're back to Hama again, the site of these huge protests. At the end of July, the Free Syrian Army starts to form with some defected Syrian army officers. And pretty much right after this, the regime decides that it is going to repress the opposition at all costs. So it again isolates Hama, sends in the army. They kill something like 100, somewhere between 100 and 150 people on the first day of this crackdown. And this is completely shocking for the opposition, because they had seen these enormous protests in Hama and thought, like, here, Hama's finally getting the justice that it deserves from what they went through in 1982. And the Assad regime is saying, no, we're in it to win it. We will repress. And so this led one Alawi activist from Tartus to say, okay, so now what? Even if we went to Al-Abbasiyin or Al-Umayyin Square, which are these big squares in Aleppo and Damascus, so what? 1 tank, 10 officers with machine guns, it would do nothing. So that's why after Ramadan, people started thinking that we needed to protect our demonstrations. This crackdown was known as the Ramadan Massacre. So as a result, the Syrian opposition really struggles to maintain nonviolent discipline during this period of time. It becomes, people want to send armed guards to their nonviolent demonstrations to help protect them, but those, the armed guards wind up immediately get into conflicts with the Syrian Shabiha or the security forces. And at the same time, the nonviolent core, like the core group of nonviolent activists, their tactical adaptations to repression were insufficient. So they either were, a number of them in fact fled the country or were arrested or killed by the regime. So that's bad up front. But then on top of that, the movement just didn't really have the tactical diversity to kind of endure this level of repression for a long period of time. So the most common tactical innovation that people talk about when they talk about the Syrian Revolution are these flying protests. So the idea was that protesters would basically be a flash mob. They would randomly appear at some part of the city, protest for 5-10 minutes tops, and then run away before the regime security apparatus got there. So on the one hand, this is an adaptation to repression. This made it harder to repress people. But on the other hand, it's not really doing what tactics of concentration are supposed to do. So the idea behind tactics of concentration are to, paralyze major urban city centers, to force, to grind daily political life to a halt, to force the regime to agree to these demands, to show overwhelming public disapproval of the regime. Flash mobs don't really do that. But what they do is allow protesters to get videos of these protest events and then post them to YouTube or send them to international media. So one LCC organizer from Raqqa told me that it doesn't matter where the protest is, it matters that it happened and that we got the video. So he's both talking about these flash mob flying protests and also the fact that protests, not major nonviolent protests, were pushed out of the urban city centers in July and August. The regime was effectively controlled the major downtown areas. So protests were happening in kind of opposition controlled neighborhoods, which is all well and good, but they didn't really impose costs on the regime in the way that kind of major downtown protests might have done. But for the opposition, they thought, well, this doesn't matter. What matters is that we're showing the world that we're still here, we're still fighting, we're not giving up. So the result of this kind of lack of tactical innovation and kind of excessive exposure to repression is that by September, October 2011, the Syrian opposition starts to escalate towards violence because many of the activists, thought that they had no choice. It was either abandon ship, give up on resistance, or adopt armed tactics. And I spoke to a number of Syrian activists who remain committed to nonviolent activism, and they described to me how they had very little to say to people who felt compelled to take up arms to defend their family. Like, what were they going to argue? They didn't have any leg to stand on, and they, many of them, they're not bitter at their compatriots for picking up arms. They just, they think it's sad, but they blame the regime. The regime's repression was the trigger for armed escalation. Okay, so to recap, the argument I'm making is that external encouragement leads to persistent, highly visible campaigns, even against tough and violent regimes where persistent, highly visible campaigns are likely to struggle and suffer excessive exposure to repression. And the kind of consequence of that is an increased risk of armed escalation. So what are some of the implications? There are a couple. So at the moment, we're living through an age of global mass protests. These figures are taken from Erica Chenoweth's recent Journal of Democracy piece, which I now realize I probably should have suggested that you read because it's short and quite good. You should go look it up. The figures show a couple things. This left-hand figure shows the rate of nonviolent and violent resistance campaigns over time. The dashed bars are nonviolent campaigns. And we see that from the 1980s onwards, there has been a kind of marked increase in the incidence of nonviolent resistance campaigns. So nonviolent protest is becoming more and more common. The right-hand figure shows the relative success rate of nonviolent and violent campaigns. This time, the nonviolent campaigns are confusingly the just solid line. But in any event, we see that in almost every time period, nonviolence is more successful than violence. However, we observed this interesting peak in the success rate of nonviolent protest in the 1990s at 65%, and it's been declining ever since. So the argument I'm making perhaps explains or offers one plausible explanation for what's going on there. So note that this peak in the 1990s happens to correspond with what I think are some of the most favorable conditions for international conditions for nonviolent protests that the world has ever seen. At this point, the US is busy enjoying its unipolar moment. It's totally uncontested on the world stage. It's very interested in democracy promotion, and it's also willing to use its military to affect those outcomes. Nobody is willing to challenge those norms. The UN is becoming increasingly powerful in this respect. And so, perhaps that helps to explain why nonviolent movements do well. But then in the 2000s, as the US gets bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US populace loses the appetite for democracy promotion. We're not really interested in foreign adventurism. Certainly under this president, the kind of US interest in even bare bones human rights rhetoric has decreased dramatically, let alone action in defense of human rights. So the issue here is that the international conditions are getting worse over time, but the rate of nonviolent protest is increasing. So what that suggests to me is that movements are challenging tougher regimes with the kind of looking at what has previously been a relatively favorable international environment and kind of not really recognizing the shifting international winds. And then that produces increasing rates of failure. So we'll have to see how those trends change based on the outcome of tomorrow's elections. And who knows, I think it's totally up in the air what either president continues to do, whether a Biden presidency would kind of rejuvenate America's commitment to human rights norms and a willingness to engage in their defense, or whether we will continue to retrench. I think that's still up in the air. And I think that has some implications for how movements are likely to behave in the years ahead and how they're likely to learn about the international environment in the years ahead. The more kind of direct policy implication has to do with how the US should be approaching supporting nonviolent campaigns in the future. So this Atlantic article titled "The Obama Doctrine" is perhaps, it might be my single most favorite read on the Obama administration. It's a really interesting look into how Obama understood several aspects of his foreign policy, but particularly Syria. So I think this quotation from Obama is quite revealing. So he says in this article that the notion that is that if you weren't going to overthrow the regime, you shouldn't have said anything. That's a weird argument to me. The notion that if we use our moral authority to say this is a brutal regime and this is not how a leader should treat his people, once you do that, you're obliged to invade the country and install a government you prefer. So Obama is trying to kind of protect his legacy here and strawman this idea that that the U.S. screwed up by encouraging the Syrian opposition. That, okay, well, clearly offering encouragement doesn't require the U.S. to go in and fix the problem. And I think from a kind of stone cold rationalist perspective, that is strictly true. Like statements of support do not necessarily require intervention. But I think this really reveals a fundamental blind spot in the way that Obama and his team understood what was going on in Syria, which was the fact that Obama did not perceive things this way did not mean that the Syrians did not perceive things this way. So kind of a riff off of this, the tried and true "with great power comes great responsibility" idea. Here it's "with great power comes great expectations." So Syrians look at Obama's statements and think, this guy is super powerful and can affect change in Syria at the snap of his fingers. People said things like, all Obama had to do was issue one airstrike on military units near the palace, and Assad would have given up. So that's the belief among the opposition. So when they see Obama saying things like, Assad should go, he needs to resign, they infer that the US is going to be acting to make that outcome happen, and that it's likely to be successful in this regard. So in my mind, I think this means that the US needs to kind of tread carefully when it decides how it chooses to speak about leaders. If it's not willing to go to the mat and push leaders out, then it needs to kind of, we can't, I guess another way of saying this is, we can't have our cake and eat it too. We want to be this beacon of human rights and democracy promotion to the world and claim that we stand up for all these values, but then not actually do the standing up for those values when push comes to shove. And I don't think we can have both of those things at once. I think we need to make some difficult choices about how we engage with these regimes. The article that I asked you to read suggests that one of the Obama administration's major mistakes was to call for Assad's departure instead of trying to negotiate out a settlement with the regime. And certainly negotiating with the Assad regime is really unpalatable. But if we weren't willing to do what was required to push Assad out, then I think that was probably the right call. Okay, just to give you a sense about other things that you might be interested in asking me about, I'm working on expanding this book project to include a couple other cases. So Bahrain in 2011 is a good example of what happens when an opposition movement mobilizes, kind of looking at a favorable international environment, but then learns that the international environment is in fact really not favorable to protest. The US and Saudi Arabia really did not want regime change in Bahrain, and the Bahraini opposition pretty quickly got the message. Lebanon 2005 is another interesting case because it helps to showcase what people have in their minds when they think, what can nonviolent protest coupled with international pressure achieve? That there's the revolution in Lebanon 2005 goes over really quickly. Assad is forced to leave Lebanon. It's extremely successful. But the conditions of possibility for that success are just not often met elsewhere. So I think that people hold up Lebanon as this kind of paradigmatic example, but it really shouldn't be held up that way. And lastly, I'm also pursuing work on when external powers support nonviolent campaigns. So no, I've talked about how the opposition thinks about the likelihood of external support, but I haven't said much about what external actors are looking for in domestic opposition partners. And I think that has a lot to do with the opposition structure, which is in turn a function of repression and can produce some kind of interesting outcomes that I'm happy to talk about. Okay, so I would love to hear all of your questions and your feedback, but more importantly, I will not be sad at all. I know this is a class, but if you haven't voted yet, like you gotta do it. You gotta do it. So I don't really mind if you jump to go vote. I believe this is being recorded, so you can catch the rest of this after that if you'd like. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew.